Wow, 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 wow. I originally started this video with the intention of doing a review of 1998 as a whole. You know, go over the movie releases, the popular music of the year, TV shows, and of course video games, and any important political scandals that may have happened. Of course, I found video games to be the most fascinating subject, so naturally I started there. I pulled up the Wikipedia article on video games released in 1998, and it quickly became apparent that it merited its own video. You know, forget the movies, forget the TV shows, 1998 was the Now, I knew off the top of my head before I had searched it that there were a few notable releases that year, but man, I hadn't realized how many industry-defining, paradigm-shifting masterpieces were released that year. And not just on like one or two platforms, I mean like on almost every video gaming platform, there was something revolutionary that came out that year. Honestly, guys, I think 1998 may have been the single greatest year for video games. And of course, because I said that, there's some troll down in the comments who's probably typing something like, what about 2011? That was the year of Skyrim and Skyward Sword. That was pretty epic. Or, what about 1971? That was the year in the first commercially available video game, Computer Space. To which I say, I don't know. Yeah, it's subjective, but you know what? It's my video, so I get to say whatever I want. Boobies. So before we jump into the games, let's just kind of recap the state of the video game industry at the beginning of 1998. By this point, Sony and Sega had their 5th generation consoles on the Western market for over 3 years. And while Sony was riding high thanks to the absolutely crushing sales of the PlayStation, Sega, well, Sega was having a little bit of a tough time, because the Saturn, I mean, it hadn't gained as much traction in the market as the PlayStation. Okay, look, I was trying to be unbiased and nice, but the fact is Sega was kind of tanking by 1998. It had become pretty apparent that the Sega Saturn was not going to recover, nor was it ever really going to make an indelible mark on the gaming scene in the United States. Now what about the big end? So the Nintendo 64 launched in 1996 in North America, and while there had already been a sizable amount of quality games released on the system, sales were lagging pretty far behind the PlayStation. This was due in part to a lack of third-party support. The Nintendo had decided to continue using cartridges, while the rest of the industry had kind of moved on to CD-ROMs, which were cheaper to manufacture and actually could fit more data on them, which was a lot more tempting to third parties. Publishers like Square, which had a long-standing relationship with Nintendo, had jumped ship. Then again, on the portable front, well, it was kind of a weird time for the portable front. Nintendo was really the only company that had anything of worth in the Game Boy, but at that point, the thing was almost a decade old, and it was showing its age, and the only thing we had on the horizon was what looked like a modest upgrade in the Game Boy Color. But the beautiful thing about 1998 was that we were in the middle, or at the very end, of the life cycle for each of these consoles, which meant that programmers really understood their architecture and really knew how to program for these systems. And then there was PC gaming. It was getting better. Sound cards were good. 3D graphics cards were becoming better and more affordable. Games were getting more complex with greater hard drive capacities. I don't know. I didn't get my first computer until I was like 12, and it was most definitely not built for gaming. But anyways, that's where the gaming scene was. So what I want to do, I want to look at each major platform and look at each of its offerings, some of the highlights that came out on that platform. And we'll start with PCs. Okay, I promise I'm only going to do this once. Even though it applies to every platform I'm going to talk about, we're just going to get it out of the way with the PC. 1998 was a landmark year for PC gaming. LucasArts proved once and for all that they were indeed the masters of the point-and-click adventure genre when they released Grim Fandango in October of that year.
Twist me up one of them, huh, fella?
Yeah. Twist this, all right?
Bet you can't do a cat.
Shows what you know, buddy. I can do anything. I can do birds, amphibians, famous poets. Go ahead, name one.
Robert Frost.
Trying to stump me, eh? Ta-da!
The game mixed LucasArts' trademark humor with some truly head-scratching puzzles and an engaging story, and it just so happens to be my favorite point-and-click adventure of all time. Well, second favorite point-and-click adventure of all time. By 1998, the first-person shooter genre on PC was making its jump from pseudo-3D graphics to fully rendered 3D, and 1998 would see a 1-2 punch to that genre that would definitively mark the era of fully rendered 3D graphics. First came Unreal, with its incredible graphics and smooth gameplay. The game set itself apart from FPS games of the period thanks to its incredible atmosphere, created by the game's flawless integration of sound, graphics, and gameplay. All of this was made possible by the game's eponymous engine, a game engine that's had a moderate amount of influence over gaming over the past 20 years. And then there was Half-Life. Legacy kinda speaks for itself. Although I would say Half-Life 2 was a much better game, the first one proved definitively that first-person shooter games could create atmospheric, engaging stories, not just have a crazy amount of gore, violence, and action on the screen. Although there's nothing wrong with that, but truly, its greatest legacy is the incredible trilogy that it spawned. It can be true in my heart. There was also StarCraft, which was an incredibly influential game for myself. I didn't get my first computer until a couple years after StarCraft came out, but it was the first game that I got because I had seen my older brother play it and it looked incredible. And really, it's what started my love with real-time strategy games. It was kind of a 1-2 punch between that and Age of Empires 2. It was also the first game that I ever played online. You have to understand that for someone like myself, who getting a computer was never really in our budget until a little bit later on, this was my first experience with interconnected play. Of course, that's not to say that online gaming was new in 1998. I mean, gosh, the first MUD was released in like 1978. Been around for about 2 decades by that point. But it was the first time that it had been accessible, at least to me. And I loved it. I love StarCraft. And I love StarCraft's expansion Brood War. I thought it was fantastic. I loved the story of Sarah Kerrigan. And it's just classic. Classic Blizzard. Okay, so that was the PC platform. Now let's take a look at the Sega Saturn. Yeah, so by 1998, it was abundantly clear that, in the West at least, the Sega Saturn was a complete and utter failure. The story as to why the Saturn had failed is super fascinating and worth its own video, but at this point, we were a year removed from the Dreamcast being launched, and so Sega was really focusing on its next gen of hardware to hopefully regain a foothold in the gaming sphere, because, you know, once the Dreamcast launched, everything was going to be fine. The biggest tragedy of the Sega Saturn and of the year 1998 has to be the fact that this was the year the Panzer Dragoon Saga came out. Fact is, there was an initial printing of 20,000 copies of the game in the United States, and very few printings after that. The game was given pretty much no chance at all to succeed in the West. And this is incredibly tragic because Panzer Dragoon Saga is considered by most, and I would include myself on this, as the greatest game on the Sega Saturn, and indeed it's one of the greatest games ever made. The game took the on-rail shooting mechanics of the regular Panzer Dragoon games and combined it with RPG elements. Had impressive graphics, had a great story with a solemn tone. It was an incredible game, but unfortunately, Sega's utter mismanagement meant that it flew under the radar. And now if you want to pick up a copy of the game, a used copy, you're looking at in the upper 200s. That's how rare it is. Look, after more than 2 decades of hindsight, it's pretty clear that Sega made a huge mistake, declining to work with Sony to co-develop a console, after Nintendo had cancelled the PlayStation add-on for the SNES in humiliating fashion. To sum it up, Sega of Japan consistently disregarded the advice of Sega of America, and in particular Tom Kalinske, aka the man responsible for Sega Genesis being a whole chapter in the history of video games instead of a footnote. Suffice it to say, 1998, like 1997, 1996, 1995, and 1994 before it, was not a kind year to Sega. And make no mistake, neither Sega nor Nintendo should have underestimated Sony. The PlayStation had already moved over 30 million units. They would go on to move over 100 million units by 2003, when the console was finally discontinued. Sony's strategy of making dev kits relatively cheap and readily available had paid off in spades, leading to a massive, quality library of games. Insomniac debuted in a big way with Spyro the Dragon. In an age where platforming mascots were king, PlayStation was doing pretty darn well, actually. Naughty Dog had already released Crash Bandicoot and a follow-up game to rave reviews and great commercial success. Actually, the third title in the series, Crash Bandicoot Warped, released in 1998 too. Damn. Still, as successful as Crash was, it was much more linear than, say, Super Mario 64. Spyro the Dragon finally brought that exploration-based platforming to the PlayStation, and it did it in glorious fashion. With a cast of fun characters, a litany of fun, interesting environments to explore, and a crap ton of things to collect, the game offered a fun, colorful experience that was on par with anything on offer from the kings of family-friendly content, Nintendo. Capcom also had a strong year on the PlayStation, starting out the year with the follow-up to Resident Evil 2. Of course, the biggest release on the system came in the form of Hideo Kojima's absolute wonder, Metal Gear Solid. The game's competent voice acting, incredible soundtrack, compelling story, and
I will show you my psychokinetic power. Put your controller on the floor. Put it down as flat as you can. That's good. Now I will move your controller by the power of my will alone. What do you think now? Can you feel my power now?
memorable characters worked together to create a game the likes of which had never been seen before. The game was, there's no other word for it, unforgettable. And it was a good indication to gamers that the PlayStation was home to experiences that really could not be found anywhere else. It was also one of the pioneers in cinematic storytelling in games. Lastly, that brings us to Nintendo. The late 90s were kind of not great for Nintendo. The company that had once dominated the gaming industry in the 80s had been humbled, first by the precocious team at Sega of America in the early 90s, and then by Sony in the mid-90s. By 1998, the Nintendo 64 was not selling anywhere near as well as the PlayStation. Third-party support was dwindling thanks to the lower costs and greater freedom associated with developing for the PlayStation. Turns out sticking with cartridges was a bad call on Nintendo's part. So 1998 started with the release of Yoshi's Story. It wasn't the most incredible game ever, but it was a recognizable franchise, and it was a decent enough game. Got the Nintendo 64 off to a pretty good start that year. In summer of that year, though, Rareware would release their first fully fledged 3D platformer, Banjo-Kazooie. And it was, well, it was pretty damn great. I mean, don't get me wrong, Super Mario 64 was an awesome, revolutionary game, blah blah blah, and it'll forever hold a special place in my heart, with the nostalgia and Princess Peach and getting the cake, but, you know, Banjo-Kazooie kind of blew it out of the water. With a gigantic repertoire of moves, environments that felt as real as they were immersive and massive, even though they had cartoonish physics, somehow added to the realism. That doesn't make any sense. I don't care. And it also had a cast of characters that were instantly classic. Banjo-Kazooie cemented its place as a Nintendo 64 essential as soon as it was released. By that September, the troubled localization of Pokemon Red and Blue finally came to an end, and they were released in North America, along with a super aggressive marketing campaign comprised of a dubbed anime show, the trading cards, toys. I mean, a crazy amount of stuff came out. And the response was, well, look, we're 20 years into it and the response is still going. Pokemon's still a thing, and it's still huge, and I still love it, and it's incredible, and it's unreal that those games single-handedly saved the Game Boy from going into retirement. It gave the Game Boy that extra few years that it needed to get along until the real successor, the Game Boy Advance, would be released. Later that year, the Nintendo 64 would be further bolstered by the release of Rogue Squadron, a game that would introduce the expansion pack, a peripheral that extended the Nintendo 64's memory for increased resolution or better performance in games. That also happened to be the first game I personally got for the Nintendo 64. Because 1998 was the year I finally got an N64 for Christmas. That was a time when Star Wars was nothing but exciting to me. Before the dark times. Before the Jar Jar. Of course, I'm leaving out the most monumental release for Nintendo that year. This game was the very definition of epic. It would raise the bar all future games would be judged by. And of course, I'm referring to Glover! Nah, I'm just messing with you. Of course you knew I was talking about Ocarina of Time. What else would it be? Ocarina of Time. That's the game that you either think is the greatest game of all time or the single most overrated game of all time. Because this is 2019, and nuanced opinions have long ago been thrown out of the window. Here's the deal, I don't think Ocarina of Time is still the greatest game of all time. I could totally see a 20-year-old today playing that game, coming away with the conclusion that it's overrated. I mean, the game came out over 20 years ago, and a lot has changed in that time. My only hope is to try to explain why this game was and is as loved as it is by so many 90s kids. It had been 6 years since the last Legend of Zelda game had graced TV screens on the SNES. Zelda 64 had been teased, delayed, teased again, hyped, delayed, and then teased as long as the Nintendo 64 had been out. Actually, before the Nintendo 64 came out. When the game finally released, it was honestly everything everybody could have hoped it would be. Granted, it has not aged perfectly, and sadly, it cast a shadow so large, it would take almost 20 years for console Zeldas to really fully escape it. But there is no denying that for 1998, Ocarina of Time was earth-shattering. It's hard to describe the feeling I got when I played that game for the first time, to somebody who wasn't around in gaming in 1998. More than any other game world I had explored up to that point, Hyrule felt like a living, breathing, immense world bursting at the seams with secrets. The magic of that game is what instilled a permanent love for gaming within me. Its massive game world, by 1998 standards, is laughable today. Games have just gotten so massive and so incredibly complex. But there was a feeling of magic the day that I put that cartridge in my Nintendo 64 and first rolled around Kokiri Forest that I honestly have yet to recapture. Look, I could keep going. The list of awesome games that came out in 1998 is incredibly long, but you know, I've got to stop the video somewhere. Sad though, I didn't get a chance to mention games like Baldur's Gate, or Fallout 2, or F-Zero X, or Thief the Dark Project. There were so many incredible games that came out in the West alone. It's strange to think that the most influential years in gaming are often those without major leaps in gaming hardware. In 1998, developers had found their footing in the 3D realm of gaming. In many ways, the year marked the real beginning of the age of 3D. The year developers had finally gotten their heads around that extra dimension of gaming. If you ever wonder why 90s kids are so fond of the decade they grew up in, it's because we got to experience years like this. We saw the rise of the internet, the rise of 3D gaming. We lived through humanity's leap into the information age. And Glover. We had Glover. Thank you so much for watching this video. I know it was a long one. If you liked it, feel free to leave a like on the video and a comment down in the comments below. Let me know what your favorite game from 1998 was. And if you like my content, consider checking out my Patreon page. Any support I get is greatly appreciated.